Well, hello and good evening. Welcome to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Timon Farley. I just felt that right there where I just got really excited because I want to thank everybody for tuning in right now. We are breaking the proverbial bottle of champagne against the bow of the ship here for the inaugural maiden voyage of Frankly Speaking. I'm joined in studio here with one of the most exceptional human beings, one of the most brilliant minds that I've had the pleasure of getting to know here in the last little bit, Mr. Paul Kennard. Paul, welcome to Square Media Network and to Frankly Speaking.
Thank you very much. And congratulations on your first show. It's an honor to be guest number one. Cheers to you and to many more
Thank
shows.
you, sir. I appreciate it. Apparently you didn't read the book of etiquette about showing up to the show with a better beard than the host, but...
No, I was at the barber yesterday.
Oh, so this is newly minted.
I mean, at least every other week.
And a shower, whether we need it or not.
You got to practice things.
To get them right.
To get them right, exactly right.
Well, cool. Well, awesome. Well, obviously, guys, based on the title that you can see here on the big screen, we are talking about atheism tonight. I hope that tonight's conversation will inspire some consternation, maybe have those of you who thankfully have tuned in tonight dig a little deeper into why you think about this concept, why you think what you think. And Paul is joining me. Paul, tell me a little bit about where you stand on this issue in terms of how you personally identify in this space.
Sure. So, I come at this space as a person who is looking for evidence.
Okay.
And, candidly, I think I can sort of start by saying, you can believe whatever you want. Mm-hmm. Proponent of freedom. I get nervous when that freedom comes in the hands of somebody who has authority or power.
Okay.
So if you are somebody who is able to make decisions about what my children learn, if you're able to make legislation,
okay.
Then I think it sort of falls into a situation of where we need to rely on a process that is fundamentally based on what our evidence is. And so knowing that,
okay.
I know the numbers. I know that 33% of folks in America identify as being Christian. That's a lot of people.
Yeah, and pretty just that one religion, given how many are out there, right?
Yeah.
And just for a frame of reference here, folks, in the discussion of atheism, I think it's one of the things for myself personally is looking at the dynamic of saying we all come from potential different ethnic backgrounds, where you come from in terms of geography, but the divide of atheism is that there is no higher dynamic there versus the other religions of the world that all have their own discussion, their own distinguishing characteristics between what they think is the actual character image of God, right?
I mean, the conversations that I have had, I think that you have had, kind of distill down to a couple questions that people are getting at, which is, what and how did I come to be? What am I made of? What happens when I die?
Sure, big ones.
And there's a lot of body of work, over a long period of time of people trying to answer that question. And I think that the tools that we have to examine those questions now are fundamentally or objectively the best that they've ever been. And
by that you mean advances in science and what we know about the physical world around us.
Our ability to observe the world beyond our own senses.
Okay. Well, and as we get ready to kick off unpacking this incredibly complex dynamic for some, and in our leading up to the show discussions, I thought one of the more interesting things that you had mentioned was that in some ways this is a much ado about nothing kind of conversation for someone who doesn't believe that there is this other aspect. And for me personally, it's an area of considerable churning at this point in my life, right? And as we get into that, I think one of the important things here, obviously, is to get a picture of both sides of the discussion in terms of our viewpoint, since we are two people speaking to the gold mics right now.
I like these.
Okay, yeah, they are. Man,
I can't tell if I should hold it up like I just won something, or I should be mindful of my distance from it.
Right, thanking friends and family for. Okay, I'm with you. So as we get into this thing here, Paul, tell me a little bit about your early life, and it doesn't necessarily have to be about your earliest recollections of middle school.
So there I was.
So there, 'tis I, this same size, with a
Yeah.
great beard.
That's right.
At 7 years old. When it comes to upbringing,
Sure.
because I think one of the first things that comes to my mind when I'm considering these questions is the basis and the initial part that I start from
Yeah.
has a lot to do with my upbringing. What were my earliest influences? Who was essentially helping, at minimum, form the building blocks upon which I would, stack the rest of what I think about religion, belief, God, etc. So for you and for our lovely listening audience, tell me a little bit about how that looked for you.
Yeah, so I find this to be a little bit of a dangerous question in the fact that it becomes one in which the more that a lot of folks who are trying to evangelize to me, right, trying to get that,
Okay.
steak knife set to get into heaven by getting the elusive atheist, right?
There's 10 points for you guys. You know that.
Right, it's incredible. So, I mean, I don't want to take it away from anybody's game, but so I say that being the fact that, so grew up in the church,
Okay.
Family was part of that sort of evangelical TV Christianity of the 80s. In my household, speaking to God was a very literal thing.
Okay.
My mom would describe things like what it felt like when the bed would sink down, when Jesus was in the room talking to her.
Okay.
We moved different places because Jesus told us to go open a business in a certain place.
So this was like the connotation to you at that age was this is your mom's wireless phone plan included text messages and direct direction from.
Yeah, and it was always interesting to me, even at like 5, 6, 7 years old, that both there was this sort of direct line to God, but there were sort of obvious things missing from the messaging.
Okay.
So, I'll tell you a sort of funny story. So I'm second grade.
Right.
Parents pull us out of school. We moved to Connecticut because Jesus thinks we should open up a convenience store. And we're there probably 3 months. And we turn around and come back because it turns out they're running a convenience store that doesn't sell alcohol and cigarettes. Not a very good business model.
And so challenging.
Yeah, and so there's this weird thing where I think at a pretty early age, you can sort of detect that like there's some
Holes.
there's some things in this sort of narrative that aren't correct, right? I mean, I watched G.I. Joe and the narratives were more like put together.
I can see how
like
you would do that.
Right.
Right. So, and direct question here, but when it came to how you felt about the other interactions in your home outside of the endeavors that your parents were undertaking in terms of their, entrepreneurial efforts here, did you feel that there were other holes there too?
Yeah, I think what was frightening, was the fact that, and was, I think what was scary as a kid is to be in a situation where somebody is telling you that they have this direct access to God that other people don't, and you don't hear anything. And in part, the reason that you don't hear anything, so we went to Pentecostal church. Speaking in tongues is fundamental in Pentecostal church, so we went to a Spirit-filled church.
Right.
So I never once spoke in tongues. I faked it, right?
There's a pressure there, right?
Oh yeah, there's a lot of expectation,
Yeah.
right? So there's a I think an initial place that a lot of atheists come from, which I think is counter to what a lot of sort of believing folks say, which is there was a time in my life when I wanted nothing more than to fit with my family and my neighbors and my culture and my church and all these things. And the more that it began to sort of crumble around me, the easier it was for me to accept the fact that it wasn't because I was broken in some way, and that perhaps some of the other things that I'm hearing here might not be right for everyone. Right. And then lo and behold, there's a certain point in your life when you realize the world's really big, right? And you realize that, oh man,
just big frame of reference.
Yeah, period. There are people who have, how is God speaking to my mother? And then there's people who don't even worship the same God who believe as intently as she does, right? Like, oh, okay, that's an interesting thing. And so that, as a result of that, there can be an education into theology. I'm very interested in the topic.
Sure.
You can dive into whatever your sort of book of choices or authors, or you can do a hard right turn into sort of genetics and
Right.
sort of how do we get here from sort of a scientific approach. And but I would say this, which is I don't take a soft position on the idea that everything just nicely plays together.
Sure. So when it comes to that dynamic, you mentioned, this very keenly remembering going to start this convenience store. It was a very short-lived expedition here. I've always known you to be a pretty thoughtful guy, right? And just from your business pursuits, everything else. Was there a point for you where you remember the separation really starting to happen, where it's like, okay, there's you mentioned the attempt to speak in tongues. I would think would give some kind of inclination that you wanted to fulfill that, even if you're feeling some kind of pull the other way. What was some of the initial? Was it research? Was it someone handed you a pamphlet about, hey, maybe the stuff that you think isn't real? Was it exposure to other kids at school or something that started to say, hey, I'm going to start doing some digging on my own?
So. Around 5th grade is when I started traveling to play sports.
Okay.
And so that is a sort of an introduction to people outside of your immediate community.
Thanks.
I think there's also a piece of that is where you start to see that other people are very happy. And oh my God, people are actually happier than my parents. Right? And, I remember walking into people's houses and thinking about them in a very sort of, trying to quantify what was going on in their house, right?
Yeah.
And there would be things like they have a walk-in pantry of food, right?
That's how I knew you were rich when I was growing up.
Oh, 100%, right?
That and if you could put your glass up to a door of an unopened refrigerator and receive ice and chilled water.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, that's
Have
shoulders of giants with technology right there, right? I mean, Elon Musk, rockets, whatever, right?
Back to my hovel where I'm going to eat cake and actually have to refill the ice trays.
Yeah,
right.
The same slot puts ice and water, magic. And then sort of thinking like, okay, kind of like reverse engineering that observation, right? Like, so they made a choice to buy extra food. They had money to buy extra food. They would say really gracious things to me like, you can take whatever you want, right?
I can still feel the shot.
Yeah, right.
Like the whole sleeve of Chips Ahoy is cool if I just...
Right.
Yeah.
There is unopened packages of Oreos. Like, I've never seen an unopened package of Oreos. Like,
Right,
maybe
right.
in transit from the grocery store to our house,
Right,
there was this.
But then from then on, it's
Yeah,
over.
but there was nobody I knew who was like, had molten, like, was like prepared and thoughtful.
So did you feel like these were folks that either were further along in their religious pursuit of something, or that they were just completely separate, and the I guess economic dynamic was different from your parents, and you're attaching that to religion in some way?
What I noticed was that the rituals were different.
Okay.
Right? So not only did they have things and appear happier, they didn't talk about God. They didn't blame God. God
okay.
wasn't the source of the Oreos.
Okay.
Right?
Gotcha.
And if there was no Oreos, it wasn't God's fault.
So there's not grace over the meal when you hang out at Andy's house?
Or maybe there was, but it wasn't this sort of like emotional, like let's get hands and let's like have a almost be in tears, while Jimmy Swaggart's on in the background on TV.
Right.
And there's just a sort of wallowing around in suffering that seemed so distant from, and so I think some of it's just simply saying to myself, like, those people seem happy. Why don't you just do what those people do?
Right.
And then you turn to find out that, I guess what those people don't just like wake up in the middle of the night and decide to move to Connecticut without a business plan.
Sure.
Right? Like, okay, like, and so those people allow themselves to say, I had a thought, and then I took it upon myself to research this thing, and then decide that it was or was not something that we should pursue, and not just sort of jump off this sort of proverbial cliff.
And that's a really interesting perspective, because for me, obviously coming from a similar background in terms of growing up in a Christian household, I think the big difference for me is that even as a mid-30s guy now, I look back at the messaging of my own parents around their biblical, coming from a Christian home, specifically as we're talking about religion in a broader sense, where there was a level of, with the noted exception that my parents aren't infallible, right? That they made mistakes, whatever else. But there is a level of consistency from Felinda and Mark Farley on the messaging of how they presented God, because we went to several different denominations of church looking back, right? And the stress point for my parents was that, and I mean by stress point in terms of how it was presented to us, was that there was a relationship aspect as opposed to this hamster wheel of things that I needed to do, that it was some conveyor belt of information that, only the special, the redeemed had. It wasn't that dynamic at all. It was like,
so it wasn't daily servitude. There wasn't like, these are the 10 things you need every day to do in order to be good. There were things that I think that we look at. Their marriage mirrored this, right? Like, you're a married man, right? There's an element of saying there's certain activities, there's certain behaviors that you do and do not engage in that are not necessarily related to just doing or just not doing, right? I love my wife, therefore there's a drop-down box of practice that doesn't have to be, well, Jimmy, if you love your wife, you don't cheat on her. It's like, no, because I love my wife, then those are things that just you would hope flow from that. So that was more the presentation of religion and God and Christianity to me, where God was a present help in a family where we grew up, where there were Christmases, and I have, part of the ink on my arms is related to, had it been for my parents, just their power of discretionary income, there wouldn't have been anything under a tree. And yet that specific Christmas, somebody out of the blue calls my parents, asks them what the top 3 things all 6, 7 of us want, and those things pop up. And on the tags, my parents put BGOG, by the grace of God, as opposed to Santa, because Santa was not presented, the Tooth Fairy, etc. Other belief-related dynamics are saying those things aren't real, and we're not going to present them, because obviously that becomes problematic when you say believe in Jesus now, right? Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, the household that my brother and I grew up in was where he was able to trick-or-treat once. I was not able to trick-or-treat ever.
Okay.
My mom would infamously say, Satan doesn't care how you come dressed to his birthday party, when I was like trying to plead to go to Hallelujah Night. You know what Hallelujah Night is, right?
Like All Hallows Eve, like
it's like the
unleaded
kids
version
come
of
to the kids come to the gym at church and
sure,
play decent basketball, not good basketball.
Right. Church basketball.
Friendly. Right? Again, everything is like a step down.
Right.
And I would say that these are the things which I felt very, very sensitive to as a kid all the time, right? Like, why do these people seem happy and have a Coca-Cola, and we seem upset and have blessed water?
Right.
It seems like it should be measurably better to be on the right side.
Right. Yeah.
And
so do you and I'm going to kind of give you a kudo here, and just kind of my perception of you is that our conversations for the very first time, beginning of getting to know you, is that I feel like you consider things on an elevated plane, if that makes sense, in terms of saying, I can see you as when you said, well, it was probably in 5th grade. In 5th grade, I don't even remember what I was considering in terms of like my own existential beliefs of things. But if you're looking like, there's something wrong with the messaging here.
Do you remember what tennis shoes you had in 5th grade?
No, I don't. I know they were from Athletic Warehouse.
I can
remember the budget, but I don't remember what they were.
And I can tell you exactly.
So
what
my point
orange and blue flights I had, and then I got to wear them for 2 weeks in a row at the Christian school that I went to, because I got hurt.
Okay.
And I could not. I had my hand all messed up, right? And so therefore, like, somehow that allowed me to wear my tennis shoes versus having to wear my harder to lace, like, loafers or whatever.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So to me, it feels like a pretty early trajectory to be considering these things. At what point were you completely done with it? Where you're like, you know what? I had, to your point in the beginning of the discussion here, looking at the preponderance of the evidence and making a decision. At what point did you feel like, I'm here and I'm comfortable with where I stand? Yeah.
So I think that there's a general arc that a lot of folks go through, and I think that anybody who's listening can probably sort of like relate to this, which is there's a part where you're believing, right, and not feeling good about yourself.
Okay.
Right. And
to the person who's moving toward an atheist,
just moving in a direction.
Okay.
Right. And and let me sort of qualify this for a second. I don't see this with the people that I know. Like my wife, for example, talks about being Chicago Catholic.
An interesting distinction. I haven't heard of this denomination.
Yeah, it means that she goes to church sometimes on Christmas.
Okay.
And you can put, you can go to church, you can say the blessing, you can do lots of things. It doesn't really matter, right? It is as culturally relevant as Christmas or Thanksgiving is culturally relevant.
Okay.
She is blessed with not having to, burden it much more than that.
Okay.
And I think that for folks who are not forced to think about it, right? Folks who it has never been a moment where they're like, oh, we're going to move across the country for this thing. It needs to, which is the equivalent in sort of the science world, was we're going to take this thing into the lab and see if it's repeatable.
How it plays out,
right? And does it work, right? I think they sort of go through a trajectory, which is one in which they go from being somebody who knows these things, knows some rituals, but they're angry at those rituals, and they like to lash out and be what I sort of say would be the kind of atheist that I don't typically like talking to.
Okay.
Because they're generally people who are just sort of repeating the same psychological sort of position as any believer.
They've just rebelled against the previous iteration.
Right. They're just, and then I think there becomes a place in which it is, you sort of stop thinking about it. And, folks, it's work gets in the way or life gets in the way or what have you. And then I think they have some experience away from that place. And now they come back and evaluate from a different position. And I see that also sort of being a Y in the road where there are folks who now say, I'm going to have children and I want to take my kids to church because I want them to have, I don't want to be responsible for teaching right and wrong, so I'm going to take them to church on Sunday morning.
Interesting. Okay.
I want them to have a community of people who are going to look after them. I want a bunch of things. And they just think somebody told me this is what you're supposed to do, so let's do that. I think when you really sort of push those people, what you find out is they're not actually all that intellectually interested in the topic in the way that I would be, and I believe you would be, if you literally thought your life was on the line.
And for me personally, that's literally where it's coming to. It's a there's an envy in me of someone who can, with a level of certainty, say, with an utter level of certainty, say that I'm here and it's candidly why I wanted you to come on the show, because I sense that same. And it's maybe an awkward comparison, but the same resolute peace in what I believe in this specific topic between you and my father.
Okay.
Right? I think that there's an openness to understand someone else's point. I don't think that there's I want to, hold you under my arm, in a headlock and make you see my side because, it's your soul or whatever else. But there's a level of taking seriously the other person's side. So as we kind of get in that, looking at to kind of like what does, pardon the,
sure.
what does an atheist believe here in the space? And you and I are coming from Judeo-Christian, essentially from the belief side of things, as opposed to the atheist belief. When it comes to, let's just juxtapose belief in God, little g or big G, in just terms of the overall, there is a divine, unseen power. Obviously a person who's Muslim is going to call that something different than the person who's, Christian. Yeah. Is that it's just a non-entity as far as you're concerned in that space?
I think first and foremost, a sort of principle of, maybe there are many principles that one has to sort of agree to in order to appreciate religion.
Okay.
And I'll let you be the expert on those, and I'll be the expert on the others.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
So
let's get into it.
I would say that a sort of fundamental principle of atheism is admitting the things that you don't know. Right? And both you as a person, you as the scientific community as a whole, sort of like where, and that for people who don't appreciate science and people who don't follow it even at sort of news level, don't appreciate this idea that good scientists are always at the cutting edge of their discipline. And they're always at the whiteboard, figuring out with that, the cusp of that, of what they have that can hold up from scientific rigor.
Okay.
Right.
And to a counterpoint in that, I would say that there's from a belief standpoint, there's still the looking at the natural world and appreciating science, but in a way that proves the existence of this greater power, right?
Maybe, right?
Okay.
I would say
from my side,
right? But I would say
I don't think that I'm just completely because I'm religious or because I am believing, quote unquote. I'm going to completely chuck science as a
sure. Let's put numbers to it, right?
Okay, sure.
Right. There's about 15% of top scientists believe that there's a God.
Okay.
Right.
Of any distinction.
Yeah.
Okay.
One of the more interesting conversations in like my world of this, and I'll right, not an academic, I'm not a scientist.
Sure.
Right. So, but one of the more interesting conversations is why the hell do 15% of people believe that?
Yeah.
Right. We don't care about the 85% at all, right? But like, why does somebody who is a Nobel Peace Prize winner believe this? Like, that's inherently interesting.
Sure.
Right? Like, that is a thing which people want to sort of dig into and research and discuss. And there are many theories about that.
Okay.
But I think sort of like fundamentally it is to say, so that neither one of us are sort of just like backing ourselves into sort of like, something that's as lame as like, Pascal's wager, right? I think we both have to admit the fact that there are holes in what Christianity or any belief system can have. Your belief system tends to fill that with God, right? Mine is filling that with one day we will know that, because if we look back 10, 50, 100, 500 years ago, we have a repeatable process of saying, that we didn't know something and that was God, and then somebody figures out the equation and goes, oh yeah, it's actually that.
Sure.
Right? Some of the greatest minds in history.
I'm with you 100% there.
Right? I mean, Isaac Newton, arguably the smartest person walking the earth at the time, which got to a place at 26, after inventing calculus in 2 months, said, I don't understand how to calculate. I don't understand the math of how multiple planets orbit each other and how gravity affects them at all the same time.
Okay.
That equation, that's God. He walked away, never did anything ever great again.
So you essentially, a belief system is filling in what it doesn't know by just slapping the label God there.
Yeah,
from your standpoint.
My standpoint is basically that, right? Which is to say something like, so if we get back to what we kind of said, what are the 3 bullet points, right? Which is where we come from, right? What are we made of, right? And what do we do when we die,
right?
There's been a time in our history when, it was heretics to suggest anything other than what, the Pope or the church sort of said about those particular things. And now we're in a situation where, Pope believes in evolution. Pope signs off on global warming, climate change. Right? These are like the process to which we're sort of coming there, which means that religion is now, the gaps that it is filling is ever smaller.
Do you think that there's the same kind of the assumption that an atheist? So, I mean, just from a how we got here, right? Dynamic. I'm assuming the evolutionary element is where you're going to pull where we came from.
100%.
Okay.
Yeah, Big Bang.
So is there not the same kind of, maybe not to the same extent as, quote, the church or Christianity, when we're looking back on, yes, it was heresy to believe blah, 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 blah. And as, the advances of medicine and science have proved that, it's a headache. We don't need to drill into your head and bleed you of your bad humors to be able to cure you, right?
Thankfully.
Yeah, especially when you have a hairline like mine, right? That's problematic.
He's got 6 holes. He's a survivor.
Sick as hell.
He's a survivor.
All those dings. When you look at some of the things about, say, how we got here from even an evolutionary period, I know there's a lot of information out there, and I've been reading as much of probably about it in the last 2 weeks as I ever have.
You could convert me at this point, I'm sure.
I mean, look,
you can argue it for me.
I think that there's a lot of things also in that dynamic of saying, like, if we're looking at the components of life, the cell, this idea that those things, given how complex they are, even in their most minute sense, that there's still an area of filling in blanks.
100%.
But for the believing person, it's to say it's God. for the person on the other side of the coin is to maybe insert as much time or as much conceptual natural world space to fill that in, right? Well, it's because it's millions and millions and millions of years as opposed to it having a starting point. Because even say with like when we were looking, I think one of the things you and I have discussed, microbiology or how cells are formed and everything like that, to be how viruses progress and things like that. Germ theory. There we go. To say there's still the issue there of how did those elements come into being, right? And from what I've been reading and everything, there's a lot of elements of saying, well, it's because there's so much time has passed, and because of those things that we've arrived at those things. You think that there's a little bit of the same,
I think
approach on both sides?
Yeah. I mean, I don't make my living, as an astrophysicist trying to explain, how the universe.
I'd be pretty hungry. No food would be in my pantry at all.
But what I can sort of tell you is that where that body of work is at the moment is knowing that it's sort of the best metaphor that that I've heard is that you took everything that's all of the base elements that are in the universe and you stuffed them into a suitcase that looked like it was going to explode and then one day exploded. Mm-hmm. The common question back is, well, what made it explode, and what's on the outside of the suitcase?
Or where did the suitcase and its contents start? Right.
And the most believers when I'm having this conversation, they're like, haha, I gotcha. Right? You're like,
I feel like I'd like to know too.
Yeah, I agree. And what I want to sort of say is that like, there's no gotcha moment, right? Because there's a group of graduate students who are smarter than you and I, who are spending every waking moment of their day asking that exact same question.
Yeah.
So in that way, these gotcha moments aren't as big for that person, because they're like, I'm actually here doing the work on that. My sort of like philosophical question, or sort of my asshole question back to folks when I say that, is, who do you think is better prepared to answer what's on the outside of the suitcase? Joel Osteen, right? Or fill in the blank with whatever, religious minister, scholar, but Joel's just fun to pick on. Right? Or, 20 of the smartest people attending MIT.
Sure.
I mean, I know who I would just put my money on.
Well, I mean, that to me sounds a little bit like taking the area of thought out of it for yourself, right? Because I don't care who's doing what at MIT. It's still the questions that we've already answered. How did I get here? What are we made of? Where are we going? Essentially, have to be answered for me, right? So,
but it doesn't change. I guess the question for me is that it seems to me that for religious people, what the fuck am I supposed to be doing here, changes drastically based off what was in the suitcase, and for me, it doesn't. Right? Well, like the point of life is the point. Is static.
Huh. And that's probably the great segue into the next dynamic here of like, who has got and why do we need or even want a higher being, right? Maybe to your point, it's the believer of any description wanting to explain the things that remain that we don't know, right? And then there's the element to your point about giving your current existence on planet rock Earth, quote unquote, meaning, and then give you the explanation of things. The things that I've run into personally for me is like that's one of the hardest things, because when it comes to the idea of belief, how I got here is not so important when I consider that I am here now.
So what is the point of life?
Great question, right? When it becomes,
can I add point B to the question too?
Hit me.
How do you grade yourself in following what you believe the point of life is? Like, you give yourself an A on a day-to-day basis.
Well, that's the kind of the bigger question too of morality and how that plays to me, right? Because there's an attaboy that we give ourselves in the training log of saying, you know what, I'm a good person. People that'll tell you, hey, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual, are doing the same thing, right? We want to believe that there's a level of, I'm using the term superiority in the wrong context here, but there's a dynamic in terms
of hierarchy.
In terms of how you view yourself, right? Yeah. Exactly, hierarchy of saying like, I am consistent with what I believe to be those markers, and for believing people, for myself, especially growing up, that there was this element of you're supposed to, right? I'm supposed to hear from God. I'm supposed to speak in tongues to what you're speaking. And if I do that, then there's a level of progression in the video game of life that gives me some indication of where I'm going. And to me, there's that rise that you come over in life where, say you grew up in America, and I'm assuming this, right? That, well, I went to middle school, therefore I go to high school. I went to high school, therefore there's some attempt to go to some dynamic of higher learning, after which I will then be in the real world, right? Mm-hmm. And that religion and Christ, and for me growing up, and those ways of seeing the world gave me hope that those progressions would be in a positive tilt if I followed whatever else, right?
Okay.
Left to my own devices and looking back, would I have done many things different? Because I don't think that you need to have a religious point of view to be moral.
Okay. And so you're saying that the point of life, I don't want to still down.
Sure.
But you're saying the point of life is to be moral.
Or to be, I think we can boil that a little bit further or make it even more mundane and saying to be a good person. Okay. I think most people would say, hey, what when we say what is the point of life or what are the markers of a good life?
Okay.
Is that I exist in some kind of quality, where possible, mutually beneficial, but certainly not harmful relationship with my fellow man.
Okay.
I take care of the things for which I'm responsible, and for those for whom I'm responsible, parents, okay, to children, spouses, to their counterpart, etc. And
are you responsible for their soul?
No, I don't know. No, because to your point about sayings of our mothers, mine was my mom would say that God doesn't have any grandchildren, in the sense that everybody must come to their own point of decision for themselves, right? So I can't necessarily I can be responsible for your soul in the same way that I'm responsible if you're crossing the street and I see a car bearing down on you and I have the opportunity to push you out of the way. Okay. But if you're adamant about, no, I'm going to walk into the street, you stay out of it, whatever else, I can't be responsible in that sense, which is how it was presented to me. We're going to raise you guys, my parents to us as children, in how we feel is the right way based on our principles. And at some point there will come a point in your life where you will make a decision to either adhere to that or to not.
When did you feel like that decision was allowed to be yours? Has it been? I'm making assumptions.
I think it was always about when you reach an age of accountability, right? We weren't automatically baptized, quote unquote. Like when you.
There are moments in people's lives, right? Mm-hmm. Like I went away to college and I wasn't in my parents' house any longer, sure, and that's when I drank alcohol and smoked cigarettes.
Sure, which there's an element of that in my experience too. But I think that wasn't necessarily about my parents trying to be controlling of my soul, as opposed to saying, you live under my roof, we pay the bills here, and you're going to behave in a certain way. That doesn't necessarily mean that they were trying to control the intent of our heart or something like that.
They're trying to keep you on the road.
Right, but there's an action. Like, you're not going to talk to your mother that way, or you're going to have chores, or you're whatever else, or you're going to interact a certain way. But it wasn't about, you're going to be a Christian, and you're going, that wasn't.
Yeah, I did talk to my mom that way, which I think is one of the products of like not being in the Chicago Catholic,
right,
bucket, right? When you're like
it was
when my mother would talk to me about people that she knew who was going to hell, and I'm like, wow, you're pretty powerful. You're dialed in.
Right.
Your life is a train wreck, though. It would be really great if you took some of this knowledge that you seem to have and foresight you have about everyone else's life
and put it in
and make any prediction about your own.
So do you think that there would have been had there been a better pathway of consistency?
This is my favorite Christian question right here.
Go,
if your mom wasn't so broken, do you think that you would love you?
Well, I don't know that. I think that everybody's broken in their own space.
Sure.
But I do think that, and that's not just about religion either. There's plenty of people with the "do as I say, not as I do" are never going to carry any water of authenticity for very long.
I think what it is that when your parents do weird, or interesting things.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole portion of life that is no longer something you just read about. It is something in which you contemplate because it is near you and in you and impacts you, right? Like you move someplace, right? I think you told me in an early conversation that your folks moved here for PTL.
Sure.
Right? Like, I mean, there are a lot of people who never leave a state in their whole life, right? And you're saying that like this was as important of a thing. It was both a job and a calling of God. We're gonna sell our house, terminate our lease, put everything we own in a car, and go start all over. And that's a big deal.
Sure, and I think that there's an element too there that was different between that and your gas station dynamic. Is that my father felt that his overarching call was to be in ministry of some kind related to music, and it was that job that presented itself that happened to be where we were. It wasn't, I'm following Jim and the tarantula of mascara that was Tammy Faye Baker, right, to North Carolina. It wasn't that kind of dynamic. So for me, and that's what I'm saying, like, I don't know that when you say like your favorite Christian question, well, had your mom been, whatever else. My question, maybe, and it's just a rephrasing of that though, is that do you think that your take on it would have been different had there been, in your own eyes, a perceived level of congruent messaging and how I see it walked out in my parents' life or my mother's life?
I think I would have gotten to the same fundamental belief system.
Okay.
I don't think that I would be somebody who was contemplating, like, do I really like the word atheist? Because it sort of empowers theists in a way that kind of bother me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, I have those kind of like discussions. I'm like, what, if you're gonna have fun with this, why don't just call me a heretic? Right? Let's just go old school with it. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe it would have made it sort of skip the part which is discovery through some anger. But I think we're sort of netting out at the same place.
Yeah. Do you think it would have taken longer?
No, I think it would have taken less energy, and I think it would have allowed for some focus on some other things. Right? Like, I mean, I didn't have a true science class until middle school, because middle school was the first time that I went to a public school.
Okay.
And man, there was some concepts there that were pretty brand new, right? Because
sure.
The elementary school, and my brother is watching this, which I hope he is. He's going to laugh about this because he was in the same school, 10 people in each grade from kindergarten to 12th grade. And there were people, they would tell us things like, Cindy got pregnant because she sat on a toilet seat and the sperm just climbed up her leg and magically impregnated her. And we all just went, oh, okay. Yeah, that makes total sense.
Till you realize.
Right, and like meanwhile, you're like cleaning toilet seats.
Differently.
Right? like, we're just working the shit out of that, right?
Sure.
You see the comment?
Give me a second here.
On YouTube, the very last one.
Are we going to the comment section now on YouTube?
We are a little bit. So
right.
We have a day trader doesn't necessarily believe that your belief is true, just following what you were taught to follow without diving deeper into doing research and finding out if it's really true.
Can you rephrase that?
I'm just reading the actual question as typed. I think it's none of the what we're talking about is like how much of the counterparts of belief that we're talking about. You're saying, hey, I don't believe in a God. Me believing that there is tied to just what we were shown. You being shown, hey, this is an incongruent message, therefore I'm gonna go the other way. I'm saying that it's congruent one, and so it holds weight and holds water for me.
Maybe.
Sure, and then,
which
is my
and it influences, right? Like I think that there's plenty of I think there's plenty of evidence that would suggest that, the reason that I am an atheist to the Christian God and not Odin is because of the time and space in which I was, I was brought up, right? So like,
sure,
less the fact that like I don't believe, and again, it's sort of hard to, this is the reason why the question is interesting, right? Like, had I been raised in the woods in Sweden a long, long time ago, and I looked around and I'm like, oh yeah, like, Odin makes a lot of sense, right?
So I'm just jump right on this, because this is probably one of the biggest points of consternation for me is the amount of influence to the common here. And thank you for Day Trader FX7883 for tuning in. How much of the responsibility of knowing is involved when I'm coming from something that's, let's say, as a monotheist, as a Christian belief system holding person, I'm not holding that there's multiple, all roads don't lead to God, right? So for the Afghani, for the person growing up in a Muslim area or in any other religion that is the predominant dynamic, how much of the influence, how much of the knowledge that's at my fingertips to find out that what are the tests that I'm quote unquote running, right?
Well, I think it probably depends on what you distill down to be the sort of qualifying event. If what you're saying is that all that really needs to happen is you need to be a good person and then you get into heaven and then we all find out the truth, then I think maybe what you're saying is that it doesn't really matter which road you took. But if what you're saying is that I believe you have to believe that Jesus died on the cross and he was the Son of God and he rose from the dead for your sins. There's all these qualifiers. Well, then what you are sort of naturally excluding those people.
Which and I'm not. I think those are the things that I've always known to be, right? But then when you start doing the looking into things, like I will consistently, and folks, for those of you who tune in, I'll consistently hold up my parents, not as as flawless examples, but of people who have, for whatever you want to say about the belief, have followed it, right? I remember seeing an interview with, I think it was Akon or something like that, and they were talking about how him and his wife have some kind of understanding about he can be as receptive of his female fans' advances, and that's okay because they have understanding. But they asked him, well, okay, so what do you do about like smoking weed and drinking? He's like, oh no, I'm Muslim. And for me, that struck me as very like, you're going to say you're incongruent. Counterpart to this guy that I knew playing basketball, working out with when I was playing overseas, the way this guy acted when we played in these, these pickup games, everybody was either in college or playing for money somewhere. He didn't swear. He was competitive without being combative, in terms of talking shit with people and getting into a scope, whatever. And I estimated for the whole summer of working out with this guy before I actually had a conversation with him that he was a Christian. And he turned out to be devout Muslim, right? Which threw me for this loop because what do you say, and that's what I meant about this whole dynamic of not needing religion per se to be a moral person, because in this Tupperware container of things that I have in my mind of things that don't exist, I got the Tooth Fairy in there, Santa Claus, Easter Bunny, and Allah is in there. Not as in a pantheon of gods where Jesus is Zeus, and then you have lesser but still actual gods. It's like, I don't even believe that Allah is real. To the point that if you could prove to me tonight, hypothetically speaking, that Christ is not God, then I wouldn't go saying, well, I'm going to attach my need for belief to something else. And be like, well, there actually is no God then. You would have to literally disprove one element to me as Timon and Farley to knock the whole element of God off the shelf for me. So the things that were coming into this dynamic of like, if you were raised to believe that way, I wonder how much of that influence is there.
So I do think that there is an element of where you are, which is you both like your parents and you think of them as happy people and a model to which it's initial first place for you to sort of contemplate.
Sure.
Right? I don't have that. Right? So, if either one of my parents and, maybe my father's watching tonight says that, heaven's a pretty good place, I'm going to research a case for hell.
Sure.
Right away. I may come back and say like, oh, he was exactly right on that. But that is hardwired into who I am, and it was confirmed with many experiences.
So one of the things that I was reading, I've been reading Christopher Hitchens' God Is Not Great book this week and kind of prep it for this podcast and wanting to understand some of the other sides of things. And one of the things he was talking about with heaven and hell is not necessarily so much that we just want there to be a good place, because why don't we just create heaven? If man and religion, if God is actually made in the image of man, which would be his dynamic, right? Which
Hitchens is a problem with.
Sure, exactly.
Hard to explain those psychopaths.
Well, right. Well, because then the creation of hell would be not even so much, to his point, is that it's not even about my desire for me personally to be in such a good place, but is to see people that I estimate to be whatever else suffering for in a hell dynamic, right?
Sure.
So when we come to these things of like, why do we even need or want a higher being? Do you think that kind of plays into what you see on the other side of the coin from belief, to say that, personally for me, I think the nature of mankind is to look for, enjoy where possible, exploit where also possible, their advantage. And the idea of belief can create that.
Right.
Do you see that as being part of, I don't want to be part of that to contribute to your moving away from it? Is it purely just a...
Right. So let's I mean, maybe just back up for 1 second and sort of say that there are a lot of people around the world who are not sitting, drinking high-quality, top-shelf alcohol, discussing this with literally no ramifications.
On gold mics.
Right.
With great beards.
Right, exactly. With wonderful beards. Right? So I think that it is a luxury for us to suggest to that people don't have real consequences for them not falling in line.
Sure. With what's established as the dynamic where they are.
Whatever is the dominant, hegemony of that place.
Sure.
Right? Whether it is as the book that they follow says, or just the person that they follow says is in the book. Right? Plenty of examples of people, not allowed to read their own book. Right? Only the guy can read the book
And tell you
what's in the book. Right?
Sure.
So I think we have to be open to the fact that there's a huge segment of people that are in that particular place, and that it is hard to know. It's hard to pull it away from survival, right? The consequences of me being kicked out of my tribe are so great that I will go forth with whatever, right? There are plenty of people who in modern day are saying the same thing, right? Like, I love my family, I love my town, I love whatever. If I marry the wrong person, if I go to the wrong school,
if I step outside of.
Yeah, I don't play basketball, whatever the thing is, right? Like, their micro community is going to think of them as not as good, right? Like, so I think that is that challenge with your own desire to survive. But I don't know that I don't know that it becomes a problem. I would say that the problem is really more like, are you interested in, are you willing to, do you have a problem that you're trying to solve? Do you have an itch that you're trying to scratch? Are you naturally curious? Right? I mean, Hitchens doesn't have I'm not a huge Hitchens fan. I mean, the guy's brilliant, and I wish I could write and think and articulate myself in the same way that he can. But I don't know that he's necessarily like the best example for people who are like, yeah, I've got a question because some things aren't right.
There's a level of at least implied anger from Hitchens toward belief.
Yeah, I mean, Dawkins is the same way. I mean, these guys are. I mean, Dawkins is been on record just like tired of explaining biology to people.
Sure.
Well, sorry, man. Like, if you're putting yourself out there as an educator to people,
you're going to want to be educated.
And you got to come back to the basics, right? Because most of us don't have time to sit around and think about what's the current thinking in, sort of evolutionary theory. Like, where is the edge of the particular discipline?
Well, and then we can bring that kind of to where the what does the existence of God or the validity of religion mean for humanity? To my point about Hitchens' kind of vitriol against it, is that there's a lot of terrible shit that has occurred in the course of human history that has been done in the name of God all over the place.
Sure.
And then when you compare that against those religions, their own books' descriptions of God, they're kind of incongruent. And for me, it looks like, is that more, does believing in God give humanity a weapon that it's really not able to handle in a way, right? Because if God told me to do it, there's no other reason that really has to be introduced into that person's mind for their justification or whatever else, right? The Crusades are now valid because it's a holy war. The 9/11 is is from the people who are extremist elements of that, it's also done in the name of God.
Yeah, I mean,
Where does that
you
fall
can
in?
read out. I mean, you can read throughout history, right? There are plenty of people who want to talk to you about how the church not doing something in a time in which they could, right? I mean, Frederick Douglass, right, 1856, right? He's writing about this in his autobiography, right? He's talking about both the idea that what his Methodist slave owner became a greater asshole, a more brutal person after converting to being a Methodist,
Right.
and that those churches in the North weren't doing anything to actually help, despite his reading of their book saying, I think this book implores you to take a position and to fight
Sure.
and treat people with love and respect like they are the children of God.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in that context, it is an exceptionally dangerous tool, right? And we also sort of, this kind of leads into this place where we can get a little bit smart ass, and we can say, like, why is God mentioned so often, in the DSM book, which is the book that psychiatrists use to diagnose people, right? Like, there's a lot of reference to God in a science book.
Sure.
Right? Like, oh, you talk to God, you take, check, right?
Right.
God gives you orders, check, right? Okay, like you see God, okay, check.
That's
Right?
going to mean a couple things.
You're going to take your clothes off and run down the street, and
We're a couple steps away.
right?
Yeah.
And who knows what you're going to do? And it is kind of odd that there is such a proximity of those two things. I mean, when was the last time you heard about anybody like running down the street saying like, Darwin was right? Like, you're going to evolve.
Right.
Right? It doesn't happen.
Well, and those are the kind of things that I just, they all seem to, personally for me, and this is kind of like where you and I have had some conversations where I don't have a glowing view of our natural state as human beings. There's not a peace element related for the amount of questions, for the amount of sleep loss, for the amount of like waiting for the other shoe to fall or the whip in the sky to crack or whatever the dynamic is that I personally feel. It's even somehow, and I don't know if this is, it might be Stockholm syndrome. It might be that I was raised in this way where I saw it was, to me, it was authentic, right? That it lined up. That this feeling of, I know that there are serious deficiencies in me as a man personally that I would estimate to be, right?
Okay.
Everybody, I think, has a capacity to be the not best version. Like, I know to do better and I don't do it. But there's always been this element, candidly speaking, of the awareness that there's some things that I don't think even fit that, like being good to your neighbor and whatever dynamics as personal personality traits, that if there is no God, if there is no higher being that is greater of me, that's able to facilitate or bring about redemption or changing of those dynamics, then there's a feeling of being lost in terms of like beyond being
Like, what's the point?
of hope, right? Like, well, if I'm just going to be a shitty person and there's nobody out there who can play physician to that, there's a feeling of hopelessness to me. And then I see someone who is a good dude. I don't believe that you're a perfect human being either, right? But at the same time,
I'm within an acceptable range of normal.
right. Yeah, you do. You fit.
That is my scientific definition.
Right.
Of right.
You're good.
I'm in an acceptable range.
Next guy.
Yeah.
Right. So, do you feel like with this existence of God and what it means for humanity in terms of each individual person and how they tie that element of hope? To me, the essence of life is having something to look forward to have a hope in. If there's not that, you see all kind of things, right? Where you look at people that survived prison camps or Holocaust survivors. It said the hope of whether it was a tenacious clinging to the fact that I'm going to see my loved ones again,
Sure.
getting them through something like that, and then people that didn't have that, being in the same conditions, not making it. Is there any part of you that looks at when you're going through a time of personal challenge, maybe potentially health or relationally or anything like that, with your belief that there's not something out there, it would make I think it would stand to reason. Then you feel that like you're the master of your own destiny and commander of the ship that way. Is there a feeling of having to figure it out yourself? That, to your point, when you said like people that, I just want my kids to go to this school, and there's an element of I can take the hands off. Jesus does take the wheel,
Yeah.
and the car will continue in a positive trajectory. Is there a feeling of pressure there for you that, well, I have to not only keep my hands on the wheel, but I have to figure out the direction and how to point the car, etc.?
So
A lot there in the question.
Yeah,
Little
that's a
rambling,
big question,
apologize.
right? And I sort of feel like we had a casual walk through like some of your darkness.
Yeah,
that is
yeah.
a whole other episode.
And I'm asking for you to bring a flashlight
Yeah, right.
or a gold microphone.
Right, which is so. Let me try to peel back some of the questions that you asked that were, I think, the bigger sort of stoplights.
Mm-hmm.
You indirectly asked me what's the point of life for me.
Sure.
It's really simple: support life.
To support life.
Yeah, support life.
Okay.
You can take that a million different ways.
Mhm.
Thankfully, there's millions of different people who are all taking it in a different way. So if you say supporting life for me is having children, great. Supporting life for me is being the best uncle. My wife and I don't have children,
Sure.
right? So we sort of talk about how do we be the best aunt and uncle possible. If you mean I want to do the most to help the climate because that's going to help people survive, great.
All falls under the category.
I find, not to say that you can't make mistakes in pursuit of that goal, but I'm okay with sort of saying that's a loose enough direction to sort of say like you're going to be okay.
Mm.
Is there an overwhelming sense of accountability? I feel like another question that you were sort of asking there. Sure, there can be,
Mm.
right? There can be a sense of, like eating my own dog food,
Yeah.
right? Like I'm coming on a show to talk to you about, that we might dive into. I had no idea what you were in research and preparation for this,
Same here.
right? So I'm like, oh man, I got to go back and sort of catch up on
Why I don't believe in something that I
Yeah.
don't think is real.
like, hello, Dr. Tyson. Like, I got to give me a brain dump on where we are in
Mm.
astrophysics this
Mm.
week.
Yeah.
So, but I look at that with a level of optimism, actually.
Mm.
I look at it as a level of optimism. I can come and like have this conversation with you. That I can go read and do and dive into that wholeheartedly and figure out what that is. Also with a sense that there's only so much time in the day,
Mm.
right? Like, and I don't know, and because there's not a sense of is anyone judging me on that in the end, right? There's not a place that my soul is going to go. It isn't that. It is more about you inviting me on the show to have a conversation with you is affirming to me that I'm doing some things right in my life,
Hmm.
right? My wife wanting to be with me every day, choosing to, right? To be with me
Sure.
every day. Not because God told her to, or she's afraid that I'll, like whip her or like whatever the sort of biblical consequences are for that. Just for some reason she loves me.
Yeah.
Pretty affirming that I'm doing something right? Right?
Mm.
If my family and my friends, want me in their life. That's affirming that I'm doing some things right.
So in a way, not bouncing off any hard surfaces that damage your quote unquote car of life, you feel, and then you're being able to point it in the right direction then.
Yeah, I mean, right? We can sort of say like we can cut with big
Right.
big swaths, right? You
Yeah.
can say, I'm pretty sure I'm not a sociopath because I think about that. I've been
Haven't
told if
killed
you think a lot
anybody,
about
right?
that, then you're probably not.
Sure.
I don't take a great level of joy in gruesome acts and hurting people.
Mhm.
So I'm probably not a psychopath. Okay, that's pretty good. So now I'm within an acceptable
Well, range of
of
normal.
normal, right? Like
I'm doing all right. I'm not going to
That's-
stress it too much.
yeah, right. It doesn't mean that like there aren't days where there's some depression. There aren't some days where, man, it'd be really great is if Jesus told me where my convenience store was I need to open.
Well, if it's about God telling us, right, one of the big things when you talk about supporting a life, when it comes to
life.
sure,
There are things of which I know about you and the way you sort of interact in this life. Right, having this podcast is supporting life.
but
There are people who are going to listen to
yeah.
this and say like,
yeah.
I got something out of that.
Well, and that's a big hope for me too. The other part of it though is I think that there's also a question for me, like having been married at one point. I remember being in the kitchen one time and my wife at the time was doing something and I remember having this flash thought of like, well, how do I know how to be a husband? How do I know? I think the only, TED talk on masculinity my dad ever really gave me was like teaching me how to shake hands. Right, don't give me any dead fish.
Lock thumbs.
Right, exactly. You get in there and let them know you're
Right.
let them know you're there.
Right foot forward.
Yeah, right. So, to me, that there's this level of knowing what to do in a situation that is going to be the right thing that, to your point, would support life. And I would kind of make a slapstick definition of morality being that way, right? If there is not a God, or if that the belief in God is more superstition than factual enterprise, where does your own personal sense of morality come from? Or do you believe that there's even the burden of where does morality come from? Like, how do you feel in terms of like how we know if God isn't real, so we're not getting it from that source,
right?
How do we know how to interact? How do we know how to support life?
Yeah. So you brought this sort of scenario up earlier, which was helping a kid out of the road when hit by a car, right? Mm-hmm. There's nothing in the Bible that talks about how to pull a kid out of the road from getting hit by a car, right? I don't think anybody even needed to teach you how that was the right thing. There's something oddly innate in you where you feel compelled to do certain things of that sort, right? A very easy argument that an anthropologist or a sociologist is going to make is that those things are necessary for people to live and coexist and to excel.
Okay.
And those people who fall into the sociopath and psychopath and sort of other outside of normal range of right,
the not Pauls,
right. They don't reproduce. They don't like, society kind of boots them out. Society says you do things that are weird. You look at kids weird, right? Like, we're gonna lock you up. We're gonna put you away. We're gonna kill you. We're gonna, put you outside. You can't be in the tribe.
Right. Not in the treehouse.
Not in the treehouse. You're fucking weird.
Yeah.
Like, we got no diagnosis for you yet because it's, 800.
This is Sparta.
Right,
down the well you go.
Yeah. So, right, like, and so, if we start talking about things like, how does the idea of evolution at both a, sort of like cellular level, but also sort of a, who is left to reproduce level, is going to impact the things in which are pushed forward. And so clearly, like, even your parents.
So you feel like the dynamic of morality is purely a result of the evolutionary process?
Yeah, you couldn't have got to Mount Sinai, right? If people were killing and raping each other, right? Nothing could have you couldn't have rallied that many people together, right? There would have been people wandering around and stealing from each other and just living horrible existence, and be like, fuck those people. Like, I'm risking my survival to spend time with these people because their agreed upon set of rules are more dangerous than nature. So don't go with them.
Okay.
And so what I would say is that, like, as a result of that, is there anything that came down on the tablets that you're impressed by, right? That you're like, oh man, people clearly before that, like.
Well, that's an interesting point, because I don't have an innate goodness of man viewpoint, and just to take it to a very. I remember growing up as a kid, you asked me, like, do I remember what kind of shoes I wear? I never once had my parents sit me down and teach me how to disobey, teach me how to lie, teach me how to hit my brother or sister, teach me whatever else. There's also this dynamic. So when I and this may be just leave it up here, things that we may not know, right?
Yeah.
When I think about an evolutionary process, I think about the organism in discussion adapting to its environment in order to continue to move to the next. In the crocodile, ripping a deer apart, as opposed to that crocodile deciding that it wants to annihilate every deer of a certain color or whatever else out there, right? There's this level of
scaled
of evil that's beyond just. Like, the converse of being moral would be to be, immoral, right? To have the psychopathic leanings or whatever else, because there's those things that do exist in big bunches, in big groups. Right?
Okay, so great. So
you know?
great. That's an interesting sort of segue. So let me ask you this sort of question in rebuttal to that, which would be, there was a time in our history where there's 50 tribes living in proximity to one another, right? And any 51 of those tribes could have different gods, right?
Sure.
And they can all be at war with each other one at a time.
Mm-hmm.
So what is more probable, that each one of those 50 gods actually has a god, and somehow we've just kind of forgotten about all their 50 gods, which means there's
Each tribe has a god.
yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
right. So what's more probable, right? Each one of those tribes has a god, and now we've just forgotten about all of those gods.
Mm-hmm.
Or the people who were leading those tribes are in a culture that supported the idea of survival through whatever means and justification through whatever means, and God's a pretty good one to rally people behind. I'm guessing you're not going to choose the first one because that's going to legitimize their 50 gods.
Right. Of the other tribes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Of all the tribes.
Mm-hmm.
Is it more believable to you that when a Islamic group decides to declare war on a Christian group, that the leader of that group is a psychopath, right?
Well, Hitchens would argue yes.
I'm interested in you.
Sure.
Right?
Well, sure.
Right?
Well, but that's my point about being a weaponized dynamic, right? I think that it allows in those because and talking about some of the different the arguments against religion is that it's been used in all kinds of bad ways, right?
Yes, but I don't think Hitchens does a really good job of sort of explaining the implications of that.
Sure, but don't
right?
but don't put it on it.
50 gods, like it's problematic to have 50 gods. We only believe in one, right?
Right. Well, he says we're trending in the right direction to move from a whole bunch of gods to being monotheistic. We're almost to the acceptable number of 0, right? But there is an element to me that says, that there is a level of evil in that, right? If the pure reason that the Islamic group is attaching a Christian group or vice versa, whatever else, is based on God told me so, right? Then I do think that there's a level of.
So what is the worst thing that if you didn't have God, you'd be doing every day? Because what I feel like we're kind of going here is that there's a dam that you're afraid might open.
Well, no. I think that there's an element of me that says that it's not necessarily about God, but it may hold the same governor plate on my reactions to things. I think I can be a pretty hot-headed guy sometimes. So, case in point, you cut me off in traffic. Is it because I'm so evolved past, violence based on a perceived slight that I don't try to run you off the road or get in a fist fight over a foul in a basketball game or whatever else? No, I'm more afraid of the legal system sending me to jail or something like that. Not necessarily that I'm just like, hey, that's not even my sphere of reaction. So my point is is there an element of God that serves that same thing? I remember there was a reading about a study where they took some kids and told them that if they, nobody was watching, if they didn't eat this cookie or did something like that, they'd get some reward.
Sure.
And nobody could see them. And when the kids thought that nobody was looking, they took the cookie. But then they put an empty chair in there and said, "Now there's somebody sitting in that chair that knows what you know. He knows when you're awake."
Sure.
And the kids wouldn't take the cookie, right? And does religion hold that same sway over our morality? It's not that the kids are going to do something terrible,
right,
but their natural inclination to serve themselves or support their own life as opposed to someone else, to yours.
Yeah.
Do you think that it serves that same space?
Let's put it this way. I am frightened probably once a month when I'm having a version of this conversation and it quickly gets to somebody says, "But why don't you rape and murder every day, Paul?" With a level of conviction.
Right. That's a whole nother.
I'm like,
maybe you're outside the sphere.
right. And I want to sort of say to them, it's like, oh no, I guess you don't understand. I actually rape and murder as frequently as I want to, which is never.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And if what you're telling me is that the reason that you don't is because you're holding on to the invisible man in the chair, well, I guess
we've got bigger problems.
I guess that's a good thing for you. But getting back to my original sort of opening, I hope you're never in a place of authority or power.
Right.
Right? We can't let you teach kids.
Sure.
What do you do? You have a job where you're away from people and you're like, okay, well maybe that'll play out, and that's kind of risky. Maybe you'll end up in doing something bad, but we're not
too
But
concerned.
but that's such a fouled or concerning, maybe is that it's that frequent for people.
Sure. Well, and that's, but I think that's probably the most crass description of that element of humanity, right? Because I don't think that I think there's more times when you bite your tongue. It's not raping and murdering, but it's teeing off on somebody.
I wasn't speaking in hyperbole when I was saying about once a month somebody will ask me that question.
I'm sure. But I feel like that's the invitation, though, of like, oh, it's an atheist.
Right.
Let's poke the bear and see like exactly how deep the rabbit hole goes. But I think that there's this element of saying, maybe it's just the Bible Belt, but this assumption that to not believe in God is to now call into question, well, what kind of animal are you, right? That there's not. I mean, maybe in the Christian
Sure.
version, you're like, then is it possible to be the noble savage, to be the noble heathen who doesn't?
Yeah.
I mean, because you look at like how.
Well, but I could also
Yeah.
sort of ask this question, which is that, I mean, how many times have you read the Bible?
Personally,
Or just sort of like, hypothetically, anybody I'm having that conversation with? Because there are a lot of people who want to talk to me about what God has said or what Jesus has said, and I've read the book way more times than they have.
sure,
Right?
which is true.
And so it's like,
What's an
Like
interesting thing to
wh-
argue from a position of authority like that too, though.
it's odd to me to like make it is really problematic, both from a sort of God of the gap perspective, but also from a moral authority position, to so comfortably come up with answers from ignorance, right? Like,
You're talking about a book that you haven't even read as your basis.
yeah,
of-
right. Like,
yeah.
like I can't imagine. I mean, I took 7 pages of notes in wanting to have this conversation. There wasn't a bunch of new stuff. It was just like, I'm gonna have a serious conversation with Ty. Let's take a moment and sort of like take him serious for him inviting me on the show.
Sure,
Right?
much appreciated.
Yeah. Imagine I thought you were the person who was responsible for what would happen to my soul and forever. And that if I misunderstood you, the consequences of I'm going to be in hell where my skin is going to melt off and I'm going to be on fire for the rest.
For eternity, yeah.
I would know the book of Timon.
Sure.
Right? Right?
Well, and that's so we can kind of answer or look at and finally the last question that we had talked about, like why are we here, what are we made of. I have come to a position in the last probably 6 months that, with the exception of what would happen, what I purely of myself, what I think happens to me, to my soul, that I have a soul, after I die, is the only real mitigating factor in terms of belief.
Okay.
Right? Because if I can establish that, if I don't even acknowledge that other religions are even viable, and yet they still can manifest the same quote unquote fruits of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, right? We can see those in all people who believe all kinds of things, right? So if it's about having those things, they're possible without saying that one God or the other stands supreme over the other ones. But this idea of, if you are a monotheistic person who does believe that my road is the only road in, and I'm transparently not in alignment with that lifestyle, that way of whatever else, what am I, to your point about, I would know the book of Timon, what peril am I putting myself in by being at best undecided, at worst maliciously rebellious in that dynamic, right? Am I just flirting with the, bet you won't zap me,
I mean,
right?
I might
Like,
argue and say, like, depends on which version of the God you want, right? If you're talking about an Old Testament God, ooh, that's dangerous.
well,
Talking about a New Testament God, well, there's a little more flexibility there.
and you believe them to be different?
I mean, Old Testament God was a maniac.
I've got my wrestling with that too, right? Well, those are kind of some of the things, like, well, which dynamic of that, whoever it is. Part of me also says this: if we're going to allow for the human conceptualizing of God, right? Not that gravity is gravity, regardless of what I think it is. So if we're looking at God in the same way, then who cares?
Or if we're just reading the brochure, where we got to read what's there.
Well, sure. So the flip side is that, like, if the creation doesn't say the creator, why have you made me so? There's this element of if God is God, where does the 900-pound gorilla with the machine gun sleep? Kind of wherever he wants to, right? I'm not really going to be able to dictate that, and there's an element of being all powerful and whatever else that, I'm kind of out of luck with. But when I'm looking at those dynamics, my main concern is what happens to me after I die.
So tell me about this, which is, I guess you want to go to heaven, right? I want to just make that
as preferred to your melted skin
okay. And
for
what,
eternity dynamic.
And what's going on in heaven? What's so exciting about heaven that and you can? I prefer you didn't explain it in contrast to hell.
Sure.
So explain to me, like, what's a day in the life of heaven?
I've got exceptionally free of disease and injury new body.
Oh, nice.
Yes, right.
That's great.
More
abs or less abs? How many abs do you have in?
If I can just keep the ones I have, I'd be good. I don't,
Welcome. Well, you're almost 40. You're not going to leave.
This is why we train.
Feel
This is
like
why
hell.
we train, Paul. You feel like hell. There's, because the other thing too is like my version of what I conceptualize heaven to be. Once again, is based on the Christian belief system. Right. I saw a cartoon that had like the Islamic version was like, here's all the virgins that you get. And there were a bunch of like nerdy dudes playing video games.
Yeah.
I don't have that dynamic. I just, it's a great question because I literally view heaven more so as being the absence of being in hell.
Okay.
Right. Like,
so you're just more afraid of hell than you are excited about
yeah.
heaven.
Like, will you be more excited about going to Carowinds or would you be more excited about not burning to death in a car fire? Whatever Carowinds has, even if it's just like crappy funnel cake and one ride, it's preferable to
Gotcha.
the option.
Gotcha. So as
and I'm literally sussing this out as we're asking the question, right? But so for me, it's like, in talking with Stephanie, she's describing the Jehovah's Witness element of the same kind of thing. What you describe heaven to be as being that, or after death, there's the 144,000 that rule with Christ over the newly or restored to factory settings version of earth. And then if you weren't, I guess, among the redeemed or whatever else, then you're just turned off, right? There's not a dynamic of hell, of eternal torment, of, the horror for a space and time when you talk about eternity, that it never ends. Well, I'm kind of like, well, I've had, being sick for some time period, it felt like forever, right? Like that's not even close, right? You can't even put your human mind around how long that is. I would prefer to just not be there.
So does that hold true to other aspects of your life? Would you prefer that? Would you prefer that the next woman that you are with is with you because you're not her abusive ex-husband, or would you prefer you're with you because you're great?
I think the dynamic for her is that
No, I'm talking about you as like in this scenario, like you were equivalent to God, right? Like,
right,
so
but that's asking if I would I want to be heaven or would I want to be hell, though?
No, I'm saying I'm saying is that like if you are the decider of who gets to be in your proximity, gets to be in the club with you,
sure,
right? Is it pleasing to you as the guy who built heaven and like this place is great, right?
Sure.
Like look at all this stuff you can do,
right?
And then you sort of find out that somebody's here because they just didn't want to go to Myrtle Beach.
Well, if I'm essentially the creator of both dynamics, that's a tough way for me to look at it. I would prefer, just in terms of man and woman, I would like you to be here because,
okay,
my abs are heaven like.
Little pillows.
Really? No, more. Yeah,
I have a big pillow.
Yeah,
one solid. Right. So you asked me earlier. You said, was there a particular moment when you felt most like you just didn't believe any of this stuff? And I remember a moment, 3rd, 4th grade, of coming to this realization that whatever pastor was up explaining how incredible heaven was going to be, and the explanation it's going to be like church every day, right, and you're just going to be walking around, you're just going to be in love with God, and you're going to be singing all the time, and it's going to be right. And I remember thinking, shit, I don't want to go there.
Right.
I just don't. That place sucks.
Which probably dovetails into my feeling of like it's just not hell.
Right.
I would sit in church as opposed to being spit roasted.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Do I have to be up there and pretend to speak in tongues too? right? Like,
Right.
well, oh man, like this. Okay, right? Average basketball, the whole right, the whole thing, right? Like, there's nothing about this place that seems
Potato salad with
right?
raisins in
And
it.
meanwhile, if you've like read, or if you've read anything in sort of the fantasy genre or sci-fi genre, right? You're immediately like going like, oh man, like non-inspired authors on their first book drew a place that people are going to that is way better than what the hand of God described as heaven.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's a problem. That's a problem. That's a problem in the sales pitch.
Right.
Right? Because at some point you're like, how are we gonna recruit new members into this? Right? And I'll go get that pitch once in a while.
Right.
Right? Like tell me about what you're selling.
Well, for me, it's like it's great points because there's some things in just sitting here at whatever time it is right now that I haven't considered. Do I think that heaven is that great? That it's a
Is that what you're really
destination.
like kicking the shit out of yourself for? Like,
no.
right? You're like, man, I'm just working really hard, and I'm just to get into this like RV park.
Right.
Like you're better than that.
Well, yeah, but I think that the dynamic is like if you don't know. I've kind of thinking analogies and pictures in a way. Like I remember you've ever been in like, and you've done this because you're a traveling businessman, applying your
That's right.
your wares,
Using miles.
right. When you're there in the terminal baggage claim area and it's snaking around to those little flaps through which the suitcase passed. Now, it breaks down in the fact that it's going to loop back around. But let's just say that all you can see is that. You don't know what's on the other side of that deal. So it could be that, do all suitcases go to heaven? I don't know. And the fact that it's an unknown for me, it's like if moral people will then be on the wrong side of the ledger there, quote unquote, right? One thing I heard in church a lot was like, there's a lot of good people who are going to go to hell.
Sure.
Right? And that's a very difficult concept.
It's hard to get members.
Well, sure. Well,
if everybody's getting in. Right? Exclusivity is a fundamental part
to
of the
my
sales
point
pitch.
about saying some people like the joy of heaven is not only that they will be there, but that other people won't.
Sure. Like, oh, she got in?
The person at, Walmart who's taking a break when I need to check out, you're probably not going to be there.
No.
So I do feel like that is the main weight of things, right? Because to your point, well, how often do you think about doing these terrible things? I don't.
Yeah,
How often do I actually do them? I don't.
I mean, if the baddest thing you do is like get angry in traffic, I would say, well, you're still within an acceptable range of normal.
Sure.
Like,
But this dynamic of saying there's a lot of research that we can do and have done, right? We've gone from where we've made advances in medicine and in science to understand that it's cold and warm fronts interacting and whatever else to cause certain things in weather. It's not Thor throwing a hammer or whatever else. That hasn't been able and won't be able to be empirically proven the same way about life after death. If there is, what it's like, where do you go? The interesting thing I've always felt is that, to your point about, the things that I was putting together at younger ages, is that if you and I both went to the same Chili's on the same street in Charlotte, North Carolina, and then we both had to describe to two people who'd never been there what that Chili's was like, I would figure that there would be some level of similarity in our description. Right? The bar's to the left, the bathrooms are located around whatever else. The people that have died and come back. Heaven's vastly different for everybody else. And somebody brought up to me like, well, maybe heaven is just about what you created your mind for it to be.
maybe. And my only response to those, there's little to no evidence of that.
Right. And
So you can believe lots of things, right? Like we can believe
that
in
it is there or that it's not.
No. I mean, let's come back to again, that's sort of the principle we began to talk about, which is the argument from ignorance.
Okay.
Right. There is a notion. There's a philosophy among believers that they want to make something credible because you can't disprove it. Right. So let's apply.
Sure.
Let's use an
Sure.
example.
Okay.
Right? Ty, I want you to prove to me that throughout our universe, there is not a unicorn. Well, You can come back to me and you can say, well, there's not a whole lot of evidence of a unicorn.
Right.
And you can say, you know,
Uh-huh.
here's
but you,
all.
but
Here's
you haven't
all,
been able to prove that it isn't there, so
here's-
therefore it is.
right. And you can say to me, here's all the equipment that I used and the research and the team that I had and the data that I collected, right? And you can say, but I can say, well, with a level of 99.6% like accuracy, I can say that a unicorn does not exist on this planet. And I go, ha, I'm still right, right?
Because you've said
There could be an invisible unicorn that you can't see because you don't love it and it doesn't reveal itself to you.
Mm.
Well, I mean, where does children know that that's not an appropriate level of? You couldn't get away with a game when you were a kid, like if you changing the rules like that, right? Like we slap you, right? Like, right? Like we drew the game in chalk for a reason, so it was permanent.
Right.
And then when you went outside, we called you a cheater. Right?
There's all kinds of
Right, like
repercussions.
like, yeah.
Whose moon bounce birthday party you would no
Right.
longer attend.
Right.
Yeah.
So I struggle with that because anyone who is creative or has their back against the wall or what have you can come up with a million different reasons for.
Yeah.
Right. Like,
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this: is there something that you would be able to point to in your own life where you can't, with some level of evidence, prove that you still hold to be?
Like, what do I struggle with?
No. I mean, like, if there's not enough evidence, right? I can't prove that the unicorn, blah 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 blah. Therefore, there's the invalidation of the.
Oh,
thought
what would I
of-
like? What would I like to be true?
No, what is in your life now that you would say, hey, I feel, believe, sway, or is a viable part of your
Sure.
existence?
Yeah.
Is there something there for you like that?
Yeah. Have you ever made water? Have you ever, like, in a lab made water?
Oh, okay. No, I've-
like taking the molecules
sure.
and you said, no. Like, I understand, right?
Right,
I
right.
know what
Yeah.
H2O means,
Right.
right? I get it. I've never done it.
Okay.
I don't even know anyone who's done it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that I can really, really like conceptualize how, like, is it just like mush together?
Mhm.
Like, right? Like what
How
happens?
do I put this together?
Right? But I drink water.
Okay.
Right? I know that my body is made up of a lot of water. I know we have a water problem. I know that there's good water I can drink and water I can't drink. Right? I know that I talk about water and I use water and water is in my life and it rains and all these sort of things in a way in which, I mean, it becomes kind of funny to say that, like, I don't know much about water. But I don't.
You don't think the believer would say that, use that exact same dynamic, replacing water with God?
Thank you for walking through that door with me.
Yeah.
Which I would say is
I
that
feel
there is
like-
a
I feel
lab
like-
where people make water. And it's a repeatable process.
Sure.
Right? There's no lab where people are making God. Joel Osteen is not making Joel Osteen's building a church and making money for himself. And for some reason hadn't gotten eye surgery.
I got a hard time with
Right, which is
Joel Osteen, period. Right?
Yeah. I
He's
mean,
a
there's-
salesman peddling in
Right. He's-
a version of religion that doesn't hold up in Sudan.
I mean, the question that I want to ask Joel Osteen, and
Why doesn't
And
God want the Sudan person to have a Mercedes too? That's what I'd like to ask.
I'd like to ask Joel, like, what is there you can't do in heaven now? What is there you can't do tomorrow that you can only do in heaven? And if heaven is so great, start doing it.
Well, we flesh that out a little bit. What
So,
do you mean?
like, if you told me something like, I was asking you to describe heaven,
Mm.
and you would not entertain me on that one, that road. I couldn't coax you down that road.
Just because it's an unformed thought to me that made me feel childish and embarrassed.
But
Sorry.
I have heard,
just being honest.
just being honest,
Frankly speaking.
I have no words. I mean, I have certainly been to, revival night
Mm.
where the guy, standing up there in the tent, like, wants to talk about all about the things that, like, aren't going to happen when we get to heaven.
Mm.
Right? So why didn't he do those things? If that's the end goal,
Sure.
right? To be able to, like, wear white and sing songs and love Jesus and whatever, just do that. You don't need me.
Right.
You make it now, right? Like, but no one does that. Everyone, there's a weird sort of psychological phenomenon with, like, believers where they're, like, obsessed with dying, right? Like, it's a really important
Well, just
thing.
because it's a certain thing for every person, regardless of
Yeah, but
anything
like,
else.
Yeah, but if you were saying to me, like, I don't make something up, right? Like, hey, Paul, like, I just gave you a free vacation. It's the most incredible. You're going to spend an eternity in, like, the most incredible place, or whatever. You can leave now, or you can leave when you die. Like, oh, well, if you sold it to me, right, I want to leave now.
Yeah, well, maybe that breaks down in terms of like there being somewhere that you're going to go there anyway. Why rush? If you mean like...
If I'm going to be in the presence of the thing that's God,
Sure.
right, and all other things pale in comparison to that thing.
Why don't I shoot myself now?
Not necessarily in like sort of a violent way, but why am I remotely afraid of dying?
But that's exact. And that is the heart of my problem. If you are certain of that, there is no, oh, death, where's your sting at that point, right? That makes a lot of sense to me. If I have any consternation about it, it almost is the same trepidation I'd feel knowing that at some point my house is going to catch fire, but I need to be sure that I have the right fire insurance policy. That's probably the depiction, you know. And I candidly, like, a lot of people I love and have influenced my life from a Christian perspective, hopefully are tuned in tonight, right?
Oh, yeah.
And these things of like,
I'm looking for some dinner invitations.
Save your soul.
Exactly.
I'll humor you.
It's divine.
I hear the gospel better at Ruth Chris. Okay. Where I was driving here, when I'm driving here, excited to be on the show, excited to have the conversation, that it still is a very, when these gold mics click off, I'm still going to have the question to be answered, right? And for me, that's probably the crux of the issue, right? Where are my morals? What does the existence of God mean for humanity? The presence of a higher being. In some ways, I feel about God, about the change of administrations, right? Like in terms of how it impacts me, even as a brown person in America with, you know, everything that swirls around the current administration and that dynamic, as opposed to saying when Obama's there, my life is not that much different, right? To your point, like I'm not out murdering and pillaging. I'm not doing any of those kind of things. So what would be different about me if I could tell myself with my eyes closed, yes, I'm living in a way that is harmonious with a Christian belief system versus how I am right now? I'm asking a whole lot of questions. What would be different? And it is mostly around that dynamic of fear of what happens when I die. If you could eradicate the fear of that, right? There's nothing there. Look, there. Pull the curtain aside. Actually, when you're dead, you just turn off.
Yeah.
To dust you go. I wouldn't do anything necessarily different in terms of how I'm living my actual life, but the consternation and the concern is probably, to your point, the most centered there of Paul of everything else. Because hopefully I'm still within the relative range of normal. I don't run you off the road when I get pissed off. I just, you know, use some language that I shouldn't or is uncouth.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, mostly the extent of it, right? So I think there's a level of wondering, for you as an atheist, is that essentially what it is? Hey, whatever you think heaven is going to be, have it right now. And I'm not concerned about what happens when...
No, the heaven sort of
pass away.
gambit is really more about putting... you know, acting on the thing which somebody sort of has certainty on, right? So, and to sort of look for congruency or sort of lack of hypocrisy in some way,
Yeah.
right? Like, and you know, I openly encourage, you know, you if you see me doing something that you're like, yeah, but that's superstitious. Why are you doing that?
Sure.
Like, you know, talk to me about it, right? Like,
Yeah.
It's not a like wake up in the morning and I'm fighting this sort of revisiting the same conversation about implications of there a God. Because I can also look at it from this perspective, which is there might be. Right?
And does that bear into anything for you? Or are you just convinced to the contrary enough that it's not worming its way into your...
No. It gets back to the evidence suggests that there's not,
sure.
right? And so let's look at, and I think that people need to sort of like understand that and appreciate that because there are many things in their life that's actually the way that they live their life, right? I get sick with something, I take this particular medication. I don't know how the medication works. I read the pamphlet, I talked to the doctor, I said something on the website. The evidence for me, based on what I know about chemistry, suggest that this is the thing I should do.
Right.
Right? That is in defiance with the way that a lot of people keep this very special topic, right? There's all these rules for operating in life, right? That 15% of top performing scientists, I'm fascinated by them because in every other area of their life is an evidence-based life. And then they take that hat off and they walk into church and they're able to part from the very thing of logic which has got them into the right school and the right internship and the right job and the Nobel Peace Prize and, pays the bills and makes their life grand.
Well, they would argue that it is exactly that pursuit that is the evidence to them of the God they believe in.
Not necessarily. I mean, some of them would.
Well, what do you mean by that then?
I mean, it depends on their area of sort of discipline, right? But I'm saying that there is a well understood there's a well understood psychological formula or sort of mode of thinking that people can hold positions in their head that just are hypocritical, right? Like,
Sure.
Like I said before, like I know you can argue with yourself. I've been on enough calls with you, like talking about this sort of lead up to this conversation, that I know that like you can hold multiple positions.
Yeah.
Right. That is the. I mean, there is a evolutionary like advantageous element to being able to think
Critically,
like
yeah.
think like the enemy, right? Like sort of
Right.
role play something, right? Like argue with yourself. Hold two things, which I'll going back to sort of like childhood stuff for a second, which I think is kind of entertaining, right? Like were you allowed to watch the Smurfs or play with a Ouija board or
No.
go to Halloween?
No.
Right. Why? Because those things were real, or because those things were fake?
Because, well, for like
And I
a
can put-
Ouija board represented that you're tampering with a very real spiritual world and the dark element of it, and that was that. The
Represented or had the capabilities of actually having you communicate with that group?
Oh, really communicate with
Okay,
it.
yeah,
Right,
so it was
like-
real.
Yeah.
It was a
Yeah.
real instrument, not a symbolic instrument of
In
witchcraft.
the specific instance of a Ouija board,
Or
sure, I felt like was it a stretch that we couldn't, watch the Disney movies that had a witch in it,
okay,
right? But I think that I do think that there are elements that are thematic in things that are if I'm a parent, is it about those things being real or not, or is it about me trying to understand that mind is being formed and
some
taking-
best practices.
Huh?
Some best practices.
Sure, right?
Yeah.
Like, okay, there's levels of stuff that, my dad, we were homeschooled when I was younger, and there was a level of the homeschool community that was very like, don't, anything that was like quote unquote secular.
Okay.
When I got interested in electric guitar, my dad gave me a Jimi Hendrix CD. Here's a guy that invented it as you know it. Very, right? That's exposing me to sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Does Hendrix represent anything godly? It should be Bill Gaither in the cathedrals.
Right.
And Gregorian chant or something. That
Right.
was the only acceptable form of, auditory experience, right? But that was also at an age where he wasn't giving to me that at a when I'm 9. I was 15.
It didn't come with LSD.
Not that particular, no. So, I see what you mean, but yeah.
Yeah, no. There's one thing that I'm curious about you from some of these conversations is, are you able to pull apart how much you believe in your dad from how much you believe in God, and how does belief in your dad influence the belief in God?
Excellent question.
Because I don't believe in my parents in that way.
Right.
Right. 'Cause
For my parents, a dad who was on a full scholarship to Princeton, had a mom that was a features producer with the network calling when she was in her television career prior to, my parents also my parents didn't grow up with Christianity being the family business. I think that's probably one of the biggest things that's given me,
Interesting. I didn't know.
has given me my perspective on them, because they didn't stay lily white for this whole trajectory. They didn't just kind of keep carrying, it wasn't all the saints come marching in. They came from very different backgrounds
Okay.
than I did. So I've told my dad, we have a have a much different relationship with my father now than I did as a kid. My dad was at least visibly unconcerned with being my buddy when I was growing up. He's my dad. He's my father, right? I would tell my dad now, and we have, go shoot guns, talk guns, and have dinner after,
Sure.
That I think Christianity is my dad is the biggest reason to either believe it or to chuck it. Because here's a man who has followed to the best of his knowledge what he believed in that way. And there's a big, if you know my family, if you've seen the kind of opportunity that we've been able to have as the Farley children, all graduating from private schools. My parents didn't have the money for that. Where does that come from, right? So that would be my evidence type things. Like, if we're looking for the evidence, it's like, well, my dad didn't make this. This didn't happen, and yet here are all these things. There's an element for me. It's like it's not necessarily belief in my dad. So, well, if dad did it, I'm just gonna kind of like brace my head against the headwinds of everything else that I see not being congruent with what he says, but him saying. His messaging to us has been like, hey, if a man will trust God, then God will bring about what he has for that person's life in a way that may be challenging. It may be very difficult in the here and now, but in the end will show itself to have been right, for lack of a better term, right?
So
and I do see that.
Are all of your siblings in a similar lane when it comes to belief?
As terms of being conflicted, or
like where are they? You don't have to give names. Or anything,
sure,
but
I would think that we're all in our own varying states of whatever else.
Okay.
But I think if you sat any one of us around the microphone, that they would echo the same dynamics in terms of not the influence of my parents in the sense of like, how we were raised, but also in being of an age where we can look back and understand what went into life at those points in times when they were saying, no, this is why, this is what's going on, and there being a level of authenticity, and then that being a big chunk of the equation when considering the overarching question of,
are they all going to say that there's a creator God?
I'd probably say yes.
Okay.
Can't speak for everybody, but there's nobody who's that I know of that would be like,
well,
no,
you know them all. So.
Well, right, but like,
I mean, I guess it's odd to me. Because the reason I sort of bring this up is because my brother is actually one of my sort of go-to people when I am thinking about something, because I'm looking for it's a sample set of two, right. So it's not exactly like
I'm not the only weird one, right?
But I'm like, okay, like, did you remember this? Did you feel this way? Did you think this way? Like,
sure.
How did you experience that?
Yeah.
Does it bother you now? Right, like those kind of things, and. We've come away from it sort of a different, place. My brother is a guy who will tell you that the world is not 10,000 years old. It's actually slightly more, which is both not a scientific or biblical position, which
it's just his.
Yeah, right. It just feels good, right? Like, so,
my man.
He believes, however, that the world was created in 7 days. When I ask him challenging questions like, in the event that your daughter had cancer, and you went to a doctor, and on the wall of the doctor was a sign that proudly announced that I skipped every class that had to do with basic biological theory and evolution. Would you keep going to that doctor? Oh, no.
Right.
Okay, so then you don't really believe it. You just
okay,
turning the knife a little bit.
All right.
Because when it really comes down to like what you can do with your kid or your loved one or what have you.
Right, but there's a big...
Is there?
Yeah, it's loaded that way.
But I would say that life is loaded.
Yeah, but not to that extreme, right? Like you can learn.
I would argue that it is.
Sure. Well,
then like 19 guys get on planes and like decide to like fly them into things because like right?
Yeah, but to say that that a doctor is going to, there's a level of saying there can be facts. Right, and then there can be people's opinion thereof, right? So one person can say we know how water's created and we can make water, right? And one person says that the molecules of the creation of this substance came from a big bang. The other person says these elements came from a creation God. They're still gonna screw how they got here. They're gonna interact or whatever same way. So I'm still going to take that class. I'm still going to go about the process of learning those things. That doesn't have to take in account.
It matters. It matters when you're stacking your argument upon the argument itself, right? So when your reason for specific belief is a scripture, right? Stories, right? This concept that God wrote this thing, it is all true, you can't question it, etc. And I would sort of say that, like, somebody who believes that the world was created in 7 days is irrational. Right?
Okay.
That's just really irrational.
Even
If-
taking into consideration that there's the whole debate around a day is 1,000 years or blah, 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 right?
I mean, if you want to sort of say,
within that.
if you sort of want to say to me that, like, the people who wrote that story prior, right, you know, the tribe of people who wrote that story were giving a symbolic story about sort of God creating a perfect world, and right, that the days are not days, it's more metaphorical,
Sure.
right? Sure. Then it's a parable, right? Like, I know
Right.
that we tell ourselves in parables.
And there's plenty of stuff like, well, what does the Bible say about smoking? Well, nobody's smoking in the Bible, so therefore it's kind of like I can't look to Scripture to be completely everything. And there's a candid aspect which is where I both argue your point and then also agree with it, right? Because a pastor would tell me, well, society doesn't determine morality according to the Bible, right? God's word stands forever. Okay, well, David's a man after God's own heart in the Bible. David has how many wives and how many concubines, which are not wives.
But that was a different time.
Right.
It was a different time.
Well, then that's just society, whatever else. So how can I be both simultaneously man after God's own heart, who does not change yesterday, today, forever?
Right.
Society does not then determine morality, and yet it was. But back then it was okay for polygamy. Obviously, ladies, this only holds up for guys because we don't have anybody in the Bible with a whole harem of captured sexual playthings, right? But
It was edited out.
oh, okay. Thanks for clearing that up. But you see what I mean? Like, to me, there's elements of I can't completely, in terms of like specifically specified in the writings of the Bible, deal with everything in life.
Sure.
And then there's some
But there are
things
people
that,
who take a lot of liberties, though.
well, sure. But then
Right.
is that more about people taking liberties or about the message that's in it? And those are the different things for me.
Well, but I guess this is the part where we have to sort of say, if said God made the game and all the pieces, and he set it up in such a way that there's, what is it, like 9 million kids a year that die under the age of 5 every year,
Sure.
right? You're like, wow, okay, that's a shocking number of things, right? So a lot of this world is in the universe. There's most of the universe, like, you can't even be, or just kill you immediately, right? It's a pretty harsh place, right? And then even then, the rules are really, really tough. And by the way, the book that he supposedly wrote is like, well, it's kind of questionable and it kind of conflicts itself. But what you actually have to believe is sort of get down to this particular piece. In order to get into heaven, which is not really described all that well, just because you don't want to go to hell, you're like, this just isn't a very good game.
Right.
Right, like, this is like,
Well, I mean, and that's part of it, right? That's
like, it's just not as eloquent, right? Like, you and I could write a better story.
sure.
We could, right? We
If it's just
do
being
some
a story.
mushrooms, go out
Right.
in the desert, right? And you and I will come up with like
great-
a really great story. You're a fantastic writer. I've seen some of the things you've written, right? Like,
Well, and that's, I think that those are the things that where this is the reason for having this as a topic for a podcast, right? It's not because I think it's cool. It's because it's edgy to be, it's kind of, I remember I got in trouble when I was in middle school. I don't know if somebody gave it to me or if I had a Quran
ooh,
at school, and that was not good.
I had a
Right.
poster of Baal on my wall as a kid. Miss Joe.
No.
Just as everybody in the audience, I'm referencing other gods in the Bible.
Right.
It's like super rebellious.
You know, and they're coming to a fact of like saying, you know what, and this is, you know, to the listening audience for anybody else who might find themselves in a similar situation, is just that I've been able to, in the last couple of days, with all this swirling around, this feeling of anxiousness, right, of just like I freaking don't really know. Not that I'm in this youth group kind of like angst of like, bro, I'm like searching. Right? Having come from that circle, you know what I'm talking about. But I'm really going to go back to the default, whatever else, to be like really and truly for myself. I want to know because it is real. I want to know because it is actual, whatever it is. To the girl who wants to be with me, I want to know that it's blah, blah, blah. I want to know those things in so much as it's possible as a human being or whatever else. And so my curiosity is extended in your direction in a big way, because I feel like there's a lack of the consternation in you believing something that's completely the antithesis of what I'm wrestling with being, right? It's almost like, well, I don't know that I could get to that side of the fence feeling, right?
Okay, so
Does that make sense?
Let me try to help you.
Like, what would show me
Let me
that?
try to like break it down in like most sort of simple terms for me, which is that if God is all loving, I'm fine,
Okay.
right? And if God's all knowing, he's pretty disappointing. No thanks.
Okay.
Because I can point to too many of examples of where all-knowing God like just made some fundamentally bad choices about design,
Okay.
right? Like
Give me at least just a basic one.
we breathe and eat and talk out of the same hole. Poor design,
Okay.
right?
I don't know. That's
People
not-
choke. Why do we need to choke? Why'd you build a system like an engineer today who was building a machine that would breathe, talk, and eat? It would have. I mean, dolphins have a separate hole for breathing and right.
Well, so do you do in the nose.
But I'm saying like dolphins don't choke. Like find me some examples.
You don't know, but that will.
Well, I'm just saying like right
okay.
like we choke in an absurd amount, given the fact, and you're like, God, like you could have fixed this,
Okay.
right? Like, right? Or the other joke, right? Like you've seen your own penis, right? Like it's a weird design, right? Like it just
I mean,
not as elegant as what like it could have been. Like if you were like trying to like,
yeah, mine's definitely not.
well, I mean, yeah,
It's terrible.
scary,
Yeah.
right? Right? So, I or volcanoes or hurricanes or all these other sort of things. Like they're just like not the elegant, right? Or just this idea, right? Like God made me, put the rules in place at the time which He made me. He knew that I wouldn't believe this stuff, and so I was going to go to hell. But for some reason, decided to put me in the game anyways, to suffer through all this stuff, to then suffer some more in the afterlife, right? Like, really? Like that's. Come on, like we're through the Enlightenment, right? We're through the Renaissance, right? We make really great stuff, right? And other areas of our life, we build and like we build upon ideas. Like
Yeah.
we have actual conversations about going to Mars, right?
Right.
Elon Musk he's going to be on Mars, right?
So here's the other thing for me right now, and part of this is like wanting to be as much in a moment as possible, right? The fact that when you talk like this, there's something in me that wants to have something to come back, right? Like I feel like Neo and Morpheus, and you've just knocked me through the pillar again, and whatever. And but the other thing is like if we were having this debate, and you were trying to give me the description of God as being a Hindu god or whatever else dynamic, I would have the same like that doesn't mean
of course.
that just seems like a bad bet. That the Allah and being the angel didn't write me in the book. That just doesn't. And it's why do I, not to say that on one side or the other, but I'm recognizing that there's a level of you're talking about my person as opposed to me being able to jump right on the same side of the table with you about like, it just doesn't seem like it makes a whole lot of sense when I consider the ideas of other
he
beliefs.
used all the same ideas to dismiss whatever religion came before.
Thank you. Right.
Right.
So why is that? And that is the point of like having these kind of conversations to me is like to be, if nothing else, more accurate in my own in the search. Right. If I don't if I don't recognize the fact that I am already an atheist with the exception of one.
Right. My favorite line.
Which is literally what it is. I don't even believe the other things are real. It's just this one situation. It's just one aspect of belief, and I, as a human being, have come to through whatever circuitous.
You can't even get on board with the idea that one of the other major religions in the world says we celebrate the same book. We just wrote another one, and we have a different name for God, and we.
Right, we came from the same tent, essentially.
Yeah.
Right, we trace the same
You're like-
lineage,
you're like,
but
not possible.
not possible. Bad idea. Yeah, and that's to me is like the.
Do you find the word atheist even funny? I do, right? Because like, what other area of life do we describe not believing in things? Right? Do we have a word for people who don't play golf?
I candidly find atheist to be, or like in the atheist, like the Hitchens or the Daniel Dennett or whoever else, to be a little bit funny because you've literally made a career of talking about what you don't even believe to be exist. I'm not going to write a book like, his book is, I don't write that, the Tooth Fairy is not real books.
Yeah, there's
and
no-
and there's no Tooth Fairy in the bed.
Yeah.
It's like I don't spend any time considering the viability and the impact of something that I don't believe in on my everyday life, and yet that's the dynamic of an atheist, quote unquote, academic.
So, but I would say this, which is that I don't know. I don't. I think you have to be very careful about putting on Hitchens, despite the sort of provocative style to which.
And forgive me for bringing it up. It's just the thing that I'm most well read in terms of.
Right, but like what
stuff
what
I've been reading
Hitchens what Hitchens' actual work was bettering the life of people who were living in Afghanistan,
Sure.
Syria, and
Exactly.
Iraq, and
Yeah.
sort of other places. And what he identified, and what people were really excited by, particularly in sort of a post 9/11 culture,
Sure.
was these others, right? Like, and their silly ways, and this guy is speaking out about it. And so, but yet it gets a little close to mine, and so
I want to
talk to you about that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And he's kind of coming about it and saying, well, it's all like in this lumped into this thing of superstition. The superstition is very dangerous thinking, and let me talk to you about sort of how you being irrational in this particular way. When you mix with poverty and war and these other things, you get to a place in which you've weaponized it.
Sure, and to terrible effect. Too.
Yeah. And right, because it's an opioid for us when this time, most Christians don't have a whole lot on the line. I remember my grandmother saying to me one time when I was having a conversation with her about this, when I was probably 20, so it's called 20 years ago, and there were two things about her that were very interesting. One was she converted to Catholicism in her 90s after being a Pentecostal of faith for a very long time.
Okay,
which is fascinating. Who does that? And her saying to me things about she refused to think that there was sort of like superstition. So I'd ask her questions like, tell me about, like, were you always like, and I was being more kind, right? I wasn't like saying,
Right,
are you
grandma.
superstitious? And I was
Right.
like, were you always spiritual? And she would say, oh, no, I wasn't always a Christian. I'm like, oh, interesting. Like, how'd you come to it? She said, well, I was at my psychic, and my psychic told me that I was going to fall down the stairs, right? And so I left the psychic, and I fell down the stairs at the psychic, and I knew that that was evil, and that I needed to go find God, right? And I'm like, wow, that is
right.
that's intense.
Well, I think some of the things too is like that people are looking at the holes in the people that are the messengers a lot of times about anything, and there's a level of getting caught there too.
Sure. Well, but that is the reality of all things.
Well, sure.
Right? Like, you can't partition off God. And
Right,
say,
but in the same way of saying, like, if we keep coming back to him, but for Hitchens to be as anti-religion because of what he's seen in the worst case scenarios of it being used, is almost is like the counterpart of your grandma's story, right? Like saying, like, is it the actual religion? Is it the actual concept of God? Is it the actual quote unquote character of the being, or whatever else, to do all these things, or does it man takes those things, recognizing its the possibilities of power over his fellow whatever else to his advantage, to use them, and then for someone to see that the malicious use of that and saying the whole thing.
I think he would probably take it a step further and sort of say that the creation of it itself was that somebody put the Bible together. King James put the Bible together and edited it in such a way to use it for a certain political and power consuming sort of endpoint.
Sure.
Right. So more than just the kind of how do you use the thing that's already here, but what tools do you have in play? Because somebody thought to themselves, what we need here is we need a hammer.
Yeah.
If we're going to try to go after these nails.
Right. Well, yeah, and
but I want to keep like scratching this itch with you, where I am fascinated by how you were fascinated with this notion of me or sort of others like me, where that you sort of think that like I don't have some struggles, right? And that I don't have curiosity perhaps, and that I'm not like I've just kind of been able to take this whole
No,
topic
no,
and sort of set it aside.
If I've come off that way, then my apologies.
I don't take that in an insulting
okay.
way.
Well, I don't mean it. I don't
Yeah.
mean that it would take it
Yeah.
insulting. I just meant for not communicating effectively.
Mm-hmm.
Apology. I mean it that there are things of which I am curious, and there are things that I would want to know more of, and things that I find to be highly provocative, even in terms of what I want to think about them. But they don't impact how well I fall asleep, how well I look at the instances of my life and wonder.
What is the biggest obstacle right now, practically speaking? Let's make this real, right?
Okay.
Like, what is the biggest obstacle that if there was no God, it would cease to be a problem for you?
Or
Like I always wanted to, I'm just making up a funny story, right?
Sure.
Like I always wanted to dance, but God says dancing
Is bad.
Is bad. So therefore I can't really do what I've always dreamed of
can't.
doing. I lay in bed and I like imagine,
someone teaching me how to Dougie
Yeah.
would be great.
Right.
Okay.
So what is that thing? Because I don't think of you in any of our sort of conversations as somebody who is lacking a complete life
Sure. I have a great life.
because of some like biblical roadblock. And so where's the
That's a great question. I think I can answer it while I have it on the tip of my tongue. I'm very aware that my life is, in terms of me, Timon Farley, has a lot of element in it that is not my own creation. Yes, I've worked hard. Yes, case in point, this podcast. I didn't lobby in the cold and work my way up through a terrible internship or whatever else to get the attention of Steve Rutherford, blah, 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 blah. It's literally a chance interaction with different people, whatever. I come from a family where I didn't have money, but I went to private schools, right? There's a lot of my life that I would be way out there in the realm of arrogance to think that it's of my own creation, right?
Okay.
So having come from the background that I came from, having read the Bible and the generation of the upright will be blessed, that there's this almost extended benefit from people that will, from a Christian standpoint, have followed God or whatever else. And I can look at my own life and say, wow, there's evidence, quote unquote, to me of that at least lining up in some way. Yep. And so the fact that there's a God makes, or the question of it is, if there is a God who is responsible for whatever way he chooses, right? Because I'm not a kid in Africa, which is interesting that all the starving kids are in Africa when your mom doesn't want you to, you need to finish the food, right?
The fly,
right,
there.
right.
The damn fly.
Damn fly. There's this element of saying, well, if I have had the benefit of blessing, quote unquote, to use the insider term, right? Mm-hmm. What is my response to that? To say,
so is your life outside of an acceptable range with normal?
To me, or in a Christian point of view?
No, just
to me, no.
Oh, okay, great. And I would argue that Steve built an awesome studio, right? And doing great work.
Yeah.
Right? And he needs people like you to come and do shows.
Sure.
Right? And it is a symbiotic relationship.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
To suggest divinity
seems
okay. Is an argument from ignorance.
Okay. Ignorance in terms of so I had someone else describe atheism as being religion being an excuse for me to not think for myself. I don't know what it sounds like, but I think I'm doing a lot of thinking. Like an absolute gargantuan, too much, almost amount of it, right?
Right.
So I don't know that I wouldn't chalk it up to being an ignorant kind of thing. I'm saying if we're both evaluating evidence,
I don't mean ignorant in the colloquial way.
I'm just for the sake of
in the absence of knowing the cause.
Definitively, sure.
Right? I would say that is, we are ignorant to the thing, right? I was talking earlier, there's a lot about the Big Bang. We have good evidence to tell the story about it.
Right.
There's other parts of it we're ignorant to it.
Right. So in the same way that there can be something that you still would hold that theory or that element of science, whatever how you want to phrase that, to me there's an element of feeling like, is this the only way to describe the life around me or the best way? I don't know if that makes any sense, right? If I'm going to say the only way I got here was because Almighty so-and-so, whatever else, or saying, is it the best way to describe? Sure, it could be pomp and or chance and circumstance happening to the good and the wicked alike, right? mean, because some of the stuff, like if you start a verse in the Bible, a lot of them I can finish, right? So which plays a lot to me. And what's interesting is the way that it plays to me when the more I know about life that I've experienced, when I'm saying, you know what, I'm just going to do whatever I think is the best situation for me right now, right? The man, like we hear all the time, like, the person who thinks they can and the person that thinks they can't, they're both right. Right? Well, that lines up with as a man thinks, so he is, right? That, sure, to your point, yeah, maybe it is the ingenuity of what Steve's, building here that allows me to have, frankly speaking, or whatever else, because it says, he causes rain to fall on the righteous and the unrighteous alike. I don't know that I don't think I live a righteous life. I think I'm a good person, but to my earlier point, like there's the dynamic within the Christian faith belief that there's good people who not going to be in the treehouse, right?
Okay, so
which is
right. So if I was if I can step into a completely different role I've ever been into, which would be if I were your pastor.
Oh, hello.
Right. What I would sort of jump in and say is that like, if you are not excited about the place you're going, why should you give a shit about the things which you have to do to get into it? Right. And I'm fascinated. I am fascinated by that as a person who just never understood why heaven was all that great. Right. As I am with people who are both in love with the idea and afraid of it. And I'm like, why don't you spend more effort like digging into that thing? Right. It's just even it's just a good developing a better sales pitch.
We're literally sitting here having had what I would hope for the show to be, having happened for me personally in a selfishly expressed way. I, prior into walking here, did not look at what do I think about the actuality of existing in heaven. To literally suss out that it, to me, as I stand here today, people have described hell as being, growing up in church, well, hell is the being outside of the presence or the absence of the presence of God. I view heaven as being the absence of hell. Really? What does that say? I don't know what it is, obviously, but that's a big point of these things. For me, it's like, when you're like, oh, I'm fascinated by why you essentially think this much about something that is relatively kind of cut and dry. In the sense of like you either choose it or you don't.
No, but it's not cut and dry from the standpoint of when people ask me why I don't rape and murder, I'm like, oh shit, this is serious to some people, right?
Well,
like,
right.
So I need to like do some thinking here, and maybe my way of supporting life, right, is being able to occasionally be able to say to somebody like, hey, like maybe you should, like there's some things to consider here, right? Like you sound like you're kicking the shit out of yourself for something that, like, I don't know that you should be.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think I think that there's a level of, and it may just be the natural human interaction dynamic. There's things about life that you value differently than I do, right? And you, we're walking in. You're talking about, well, this business plan is going this way and whatever else. I don't really give a crap about too much entrepreneurial stuff. If you were to say, Steve's been able to monetize Square Media Network, and because of that, I have an opportunity to, I don't care about it. Me, even if it's just the maybe it's my own personal existential crisis, maybe it's just the exercise of a mind that wants to know. Yeah, maybe that's all the above is true.
I mean, you can just be curious, right? I would hope a guy that's going to run a weekly podcast is definitely curious, right? Right?
It's going to get old quick.
Like, sorry, Steve, he's got 6 episodes. That's all he's got.
And we're done. And I'm spent.
Exactly.
Well, man.
Are you feeling good about this?
I'm feeling very good of having been able to set across from. Yeah,
right.
I am. And there's a little sadism in me, I guess, that really likes the sting of looking at things that to me are very, very important, and there are also things that are not. As we move forward here, big things with Square Media Network, definitely something building and growing here. Mr. Joel Ford, his situation will be coming to you tomorrow, 7 p.m. You can tune into that station, that show, and hear his conversation with his guest. We thank you guys from joining wherever you have been. This has been an experience that I've really been excited about, and so for those of you who got to share it with us for the first episode, the first night here, Appreciate you guys. Hope you guys have a good week. Talk to you soon.